It started with the whispers. Faint at first, like a distant breeze brushing through a hollow room. Clara heard them every night as the clock struck 12. They weren't words she could understand, just disjointed murmurs that slithered into her ears and gnawed at her peace. At first, she thought it was the house settling. Old wood creaked. Pipes groaned. It was nothing unusual for the decrepit mansion she'd inherited from her estranged uncle. But then, the shadow appeared. It always came at midnight, a shape darker than the night itself, seeping out from the corners of a bedroom like spilled ink. It never moved, never shifted, but it loomed, an ominous blot that consumed her room's faint moonlight. Clara felt its eyes, though it had none. She felt its breath, though it made no sound. That night, she decided she'd had enough. Armed with her phone's flashlight and a carving knife she'd snatched from the kitchen, she waited. Midnight crept closer, and the air in her room grew dense. It was as if the very oxygen carried a weight, pressing on her chest. The whispers started again, louder this time, forming twisted syllables that clawed at the edges of her sanity. The clock struck 12, and the shadow emerged. Clara turned on her flashlight, its beam slicing through the darkness. But the shadow didn't dissolve. It thickened. The light seemed to feed it, its edges growing sharper, almost humanoid. And then it moved. The first step was slow, deliberate, like it wanted her to watch. Her breath hitched as the thing dragged its inky form across the floor, its limbs bending at unnatural angles. She pointed the flashlight directly at it, and for a moment, she swore she saw something within the darkness of the eyes. Red, glowing, hate-filled. "Leave me alone," Clara screamed, thrusting the knife in front of her. The shadow stopped, tilting its head as if amused. Then, in one fluid motion, it lunged. The flashlight dropped from Clara's trembling hands, its beam rolling wildly across the room. She swung the knife blindly, the blade meeting no resistance as the shadow engulfed her. Cold. It was the first thing she felt, an unbearable, bone-deep cold that froze a scream in her throat. And then, the pain began. It wasn't physical at first. It was in her head. Memories she didn't recognize flooded her mind. Faces she'd never seen, screams that weren't her own. A woman with hollow eyes and a mouth sewn shut. A child clawing at the dirt of an unmarked grave. Blood. So much blood. Clara's body convulsed, her nails scraping against the wooden floor as she tried to crawl away. The shadow pressed closer, its whispers now a deafening roar, repeating a single, chilling phrase. "You belong to us?" And then, as suddenly as it began, it stopped. Clara was alone in her room. The knife lay in her hand, now coated with something sticky and black. Her flashlight flickered weakly, casting fleeting glimpses of her surroundings. The room was the same, yet different. Scratches marred the walls, deep and jagged. A puddle of dark liquid pooled beneath her, its metallic scent filling the air. But the most horrifying detail was the mirror. Her reflection stood motionless, staring back at her. Its lips curled into a smile that wasn't her own. The shadow wasn't gone. It was inside her now. Clara stumbled back from the mirror, her knees buckling as the air grew colder around her. The face in the reflection, a twisted mimicry of her own, watched her, its grin stretching far too wide, exposing jagged teeth that weren't hers. Her breathing came in shallow gasps, and for a moment, she questioned if she was even awake. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "This isn't real." The reflection blinked. She hadn't. Her heart thudded violently in her chest as the figure in the mirror tilted its head, studying her with unnatural precision. Then, with agonizing slowness, it raised its hand and placed it against the glass. "Help me," it mouthed silently. Clara froze, her trembling hand instinctively moving to touch the mirror, though every fiber of her being screamed for her to run. The instant her fingertips met the cold surface, the glass rippled like water. A shock of ice ran through her arm, and she yanked her hand back, but it was too late. The reflection's hand burst through the mirror, grabbing her wrist with inhuman strength. Clara screamed, the sound echoing in the small room as the hand dragged her closer to the now whirling surface. She fought against it, her legs kicking wildly, but the pull was relentless. Her scream stopped abruptly as her head plunged into the mirror. The world on the other side was suffocating. Clara's body felt weightless, her limbs floating as though she was submerged in ice-cold water. Shadows swirled around her, whispering unintelligible secrets that pricked at her sanity. She could see nothing but faint outlines of shapes that shifted and writhed, almost human but not quite. "Where am I?" Clara's voice was barely a croak, swallowed by the oppressive darkness. "You're home." The voice wasn't hers, but it came from within her. It echoed in her skull, crawling under her skin like a living thing. She clutched her head, trying to drown it out, but it only grew louder, filling her mind with images she couldn't unsee. A room drenched in blood, walls lined with faces, their mouths sewn shut, their eyes staring into nothingness. A black pit in the center, pulsating with a life of its own. "You've been chosen," the voice continued, cold and detached. "The gatekeeper always returns." "I'm not," Clara tried to protest, but her words were drowned by a piercing shriek. One of the shadowy figures lunged at her, its hands clawing at her skin. She swung wildly, her hands connecting with nothing, yet the pain was real. Deep gashes opened along her arms and legs, blood spiraling around her like crimson ribbons in the dark void. "You can't fight them," the voice taunted. "You never could." Her vision blurred as she stumbled forward, her body dragged by an unseen force toward the black pit. She could feel its pull, a gravitational hunger that threatened to tear her apart. Her feet skidded on the non-existent ground, her hands clawing at the surrounding nothingness, desperate for anything to anchor herself. A figure emerged from the shadows. Unlike the others, it was clear solid. A woman, her face veiled, her dress tattered and soaked with something thick and dark. She raised a hand, and the pit's pull stopped. Clara gasped, collapsing to her knees as the woman approached. The whispers ceased, replaced by a silence so profound it was deafening. "Why are you here?" the woman asked, her voice echoing with an ethereal calm. I don't know," Clara cried. "Please, I just want to go home." The woman tilted her head, considering her words. "Home? You are home, child. You've been here before. Furthermore, you've just forgotten." No. Clara shook her head violently. "This isn't my home. I don't belong here." The woman knelt before her, lifting Clara's chin with a cold, skeletal hand. The veil slipped slightly, revealing hollow sockets where eyes should have been. "You can't leave," the woman said softly, almost pitying. "You are the key. You always were." Before Clara could respond, the woman's hand plunged into her chest. The pain was indescribable. It wasn't just physical. It was as though the very essence of her being was being torn apart. She screamed, her vision flickering as memories hers and not hers flashed before her eyes. Faces, names, voices, a child crying, a man begging for mercy, blood pooling on the floor, and then silence. Clara awoke in her room, gasping for air. Her body ached, her arms and legs covered in jagged scars. The mirror stood before her, whole again, but her reflection wasn't there. Instead, the surface was black, swirling like ink, and faint whispers began to rise. "You can't run," the voice in her head whispered, and deep within her chest, she felt it. The shadow wasn't just inside her, it was her now, and midnight was only the beginning. Clara sat on the floor, her back pressed against the cold wall, staring at the mirror that no longer reflected her. The swirling blackness in its surface seemed alive, pulsating with an unnatural rhythm. Her breathing was ragged, and her mind raced with questions she couldn't answer. But one thing was certain, she wasn't alone anymore. The whispers grew louder, forming fractured sentences that felt like shards of glass piercing her thoughts. "You were chosen. The gate must open. The blood binds." Clara clutched her head, trying to block out the voices, but they were inside her now. Her chest burned, a deep, searing pain as if something was trying to crawl its way out. She looked down and saw her veins darkening, turning black as the shadow claimed more of her. "No," she whispered through gritted teeth. "You won't take me." But even as she said it, she felt the futility. The room seemed to close in around her, the walls shifting, stretching like they were alive. The air grew heavy with the smell of rot, and the faint sound of scratching echoed from the walls. Clara forced herself to her feet, clutching the knife she'd dropped earlier. Her grip tightened as she stared at the mirror. "Why me?" she demanded, her voice trembling but defiant. "What do you want from me?" The mirror rippled, and a figure emerged from the blackness. It was her reflection, but distorted, its face twisted with malice, its eyes glowing a sickly red. "The gatekeeper doesn't choose," it said, its voice layered with 1,000 others. "The gatekeeper is chosen." Clara stepped back as the figure reached out, its hand pressing against the glass. The surface stretched, the barrier between them thinning. She knew instinctively that if the figure stepped through, it would be over. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't just a part of her. It was something far older, something that had been waiting. Desperation overtook her. Clara raised the knife and pointed it at the mirror. "Stay back," she screamed. The reflection smiled, a cruel, knowing grin. "You can't kill me. I'm you." Clara hesitated, the weight of its words sinking in. But then she remembered the pain, the cold, the whispers, the shadows, and something inside her snapped. "No," she said, her voice steady now. "You're not me." Before she could second-guess herself, Clara plunged the knife into her own chest. The pain was immediate and excruciating, but it was also freeing. The moment the blade pierced her heart, the whispers stopped. The shadow within her recoiled, writhing and screaming as it was pulled back toward the mirror. Clara fell to her knees, blood pouring from the wound, but she didn't let go of the knife. The mirror cracked, a web of fractures spreading across its surface as the shadow thrashed violently. With one final, guttural scream, it was sucked back into the void, and the glass shattered, raining shards around her. Clara collapsed onto the floor, her vision fading as the room returned to silence. She awoke to sunlight streaming through the windows. The oppressive darkness was gone, replaced by the soft hum of morning. Clara sat up slowly, wincing at the pain in her chest. When she looked down, she saw the wound was gone, only a faint scar remained. The mirror was gone, too. In its place was an empty frame, the edges scorched black. For a moment, Clara allowed herself to hope that it was over. But deep down, she knew better. The shadow was gone for now, but she could still feel a faint trace of it lingering in her veins, like a sliver of ice buried too deep to reach. As she stood, her reflection in the window caught her eye. It looked like a tired, pale, but undeniably her. Then it blinked, and Clara hadn't. She didn't scream this time. She simply turned away, clutching the scar on her chest. Midnight would come again. It always did. And when it did, she would be ready.